Hi, and welcome back to Postscript. I'm John Peterson from the Arlington Institute. You found yourself in our little studio here in Berkeley Springs, West Virginia, about 100 miles from Washington and Baltimore, and we get together like this once a month for a program that the Arlington Institute sponsors called Transition Talks. And it's a series of speakers that we have in presentations and sometimes workshops that are all about the extraordinary kind of change that's going on in the world right now, the amazing kind of transition to a new world and a new human being. And our visitors today are Dr. Carrie Hempel and Dr. Brian Sanderoff from Baltimore. And they are at the leading edge in the forefront of the use of medical cannabis. And we're really happy to have you back with us.
Thanks.
Okay.
We had a great conversation in the previous segment. We hope that if you'll go back and see that, about what medical cannabis is all about and kind of how it works and what its applications are and the amazing kind of benefits that it brings to all kinds of situations. And we wanted to talk a little bit this time about kind of the history and where does this stuff come from and what's its kind of function in social kind of terms and cultural kind of things and the evolution of the species, I suppose. And you guys know about this.
Yeah, it's something that we find really fascinating. It's part of what sort of brought us together to do work was an interest in that spiritual part of this plant and the idea of plant medicine and that kind of thing. And it's our belief that, as it turns out, man and cannabis have co-evolved, and sort of the definition of that means that each has benefited the other, and as far as evolution goes, each would not be where they are today without the influence of the other.
Wow.
And you know, there's some really compelling historical information that really supports this idea. I mean, the truth is that we as a species would not have been able to travel the globe the way we have in the relatively short period of time that we have without hemp, without cannabis.
What do you mean?
Clothing, ropes. Those ropes were first used to harness horses, which allowed us to then move, and then ultimately all of our seafaring vessels, which allowed us to really populate the world, would not have happened without hemp.
Wow.
And we also believe that this endocannabinoid system, the system of receptor sites, plays a very important role with our ability to adapt, not just physically, but also emotionally and spiritually. And so imagine cavemen who have their hemp rope, and they've got some old rope, and they're sitting around their fire at night, and you know, because it's old rope, they just burn it, and all of a sudden they notice that they're not quite as sore from the day's activities as they were before. And there's actually some evidence that is pointing to the idea that it was the influence of cannabis and its effect on our ability to think that actually took us out of the Stone Age as a people.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'd never heard that before.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. There was a study, and I had told you about it when we first talked about this, where they took some mice and they developed knockout mice that don't have any endocannabinoid receptors. And so then they do this maze, this water maze test. So they take regular mice, they put them in the maze, and there's they're swimming in the water, and then there's an island in the middle that they can find that they survive. And then they take the knockout mice that don't have endocannabinoid receptors, they put them in there, same thing, they find the island. Take the mice out, move the island to another place in the maze. The regular mice can find the new island. The knockout mice that don't have endocannabinoid receptors, they go to the same place and they ultimately end up drowning because they cannot adapt. They cannot think outside of the box. And so it brings up this concept of flips and blips. There are forward-looking people. Those are people that have endocannabinoid receptors. And there are backwards-looking people who don't have them. And it's the backwards-looking people who are not evolving or helping us evolve as a species, as well as the forward-thinking. Some of us might say that the politicians are actually the blips of the world.
Some of my friends. Yeah, right. No, but literally, so you're saying that within the broadly within the human population, there are some who respond to these kinds of things and not? I mean, talk about that.
Yeah, and we found that medically, right? I mean, there are some patients that we look to treat medically, and they're not getting a benefit from using the medicine like we expect them to, and literally, I can't get them high. I can give them high doses of THC that would be elephant tranquilizer for most people, and for them, they don't feel anything. And I've seen studies in men who have prostate cancer that some of them don't have endocannabinoid receptors in their prostate, and that's part of what may make them more susceptible to certain diseases.
Why do you think that is?
Genetic factors.
Yeah.
Endocannabinoids, when we say endo, it means that the body makes it. And so there's an endocannabinoid system, which also means that your body has the ability to make cannabinoids itself. Anytime you have a receptor site that a
So
chemical...
you're saying that your body has not made the receptors, which would suggest that that's part of a less than ideal kind of condition that somebody has found themselves in for whatever kind of reason.
And in a proper environment where natural selection actually means something to a species,
Right.
you would find those people in that species kind of weed themselves out because they can't survive. But in our society, where it's really survival of the fattest instead of survival of the fittest anymore, we have people who, if they were left to their own devices within nature in a wilder environment, probably wouldn't have survived and created offspring that would go on and on. Does that make sense? Kind of a cool statement.
Sure, it makes sense, but what you're talking about is something really fundamental to the evolution of the species. I mean, in more fundamental terms than almost anything else I've ever, that essentially says that you've got this structural kind of part. I mean, this is not Darwinian. This is something else I don't know about.
Yeah, the term we like to use, and I know this resonates with you, is the idea of evolving from Homo sapien to Homo spiritus.
Yeah.
Right?
And so what you're suggesting is that these receptors play an active and facilitating role in this evolutionary process. And how does that work?
Yeah.
I can talk about that a little. So, I think the concept of Homo sapiens to Homo spiritus involves several levels. There's physical transformation and kind of transcendence, emotional and spiritual, and how we work with our environment. What we're finding medically is that tumors and tissues throughout the entire body that have abnormal or absent expression of certain types of cannabis receptors respond differently to treatments designed to eradicate, those illnesses, especially cancer. I think just about every cancer is being studied now for the presence of cannabinoid receptors and on the various tumors, and how that interacts with the types of chemotherapy, or whether cannabis alone can impact the way those tumors work. And not all of them respond the same way, and the ones that do not work well with cannabis and cannabinoids seem to be, expressing themselves in a way that's not as favorable, suggesting that the presence of the cannabis and cannabinoid receptors that are functional and interactive portends better risk or a better chance of surviving.
So cancer cells also have cannabinoid receptors on them, but they work differently than they work in humans. Hitting those receptors would actually remind those cells to get old and die instead of staying young and keep reproducing and reproducing and reproducing, which is one way to describe what a cancer is.
Do you have any sense that that the plant is sentient in any kind of way? And
It's our belief.
why?
How would you describe that?
Well, I think as humans, we tend to associate intelligence with a consciousness or being able to think. But the truth is that, plants display tremendous intelligence in how they respond to their environment, how they adapt their features to attract, species that will eat them and spread and and also to become valuable and indispensable to the right species so that it then is carried with it across the globe. And that's really what we see happening with cannabis.
That's sort of the coevolution piece. And
Yeah.
so endocannabinoid receptors developed in animals. I want to say humans because it goes way back, about the same time that opioid receptors did. And you're talking about over 200 million years ago. The earliest record that we can find of cannabis being on this planet is 65 million years ago. And so here's an opportunity for interaction with a human with a chemical after we already had reception or the ability to make those chemicals ourselves as well. And that partnership, if you look at it that way, served both species. And so first crop cultivated, cannabis, because of how useful that crop was for clothes, for paper, for the oil. Nutritionally, it's said
this
that
was the principal crop for paper for centuries.
yeah,
kind of.
oh, millennia.
Yeah.
Yeah, the oil burns better than other oils do. The actual hemp seed as a source of nutrition is maybe per weight, maybe the best nutrient out there that can be found. And so when you talk about an intelligence, absolutely, and that partnership.
It's this synergistic kind of relationship is kind of interesting because when our early conversation we had, I talked to you about a book that I had read, but this marvelous, I don't know whether he was a botanist, he was certainly some kind of a scientist who had studied all of this stuff, and what he found out is historically that plants and animals as well as humans go toward, in his case he was talking about ayahuasca and some of the other kind of psychoactive.
Is that the Botany of Desire?
Sounds about right, but I don't think, but I don't remember. But essentially that there was this kind of role that these plants played in facilitating and opening up and enabling the kind of the Einsteinian notion that says you got to get to another level to solve the next problem because you're in the corner and you can't get out right now, and you can't solve it with the old things.
Yeah.
And if that turns out to be the case, and coupled with some of the things you're talking about, is that some folks have their bodies have produced sensitivities to these kinds of substances and others don't, then you start to have this very interesting kind of an intelligent, highly dynamic kind of evolutionary kind of system or process.
And maybe that divergence that you were talking about earlier, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is fascinating.
Well, the thing, let me try something else on you here. I'm convinced that the way that you deal with this emerging new world essentially is, and the kind of one of the key characteristics of the emerging new human is the kind of the elimination of fear. That you are able to deal with all of these changes and this stuff and the kind of the unpinning of the old kind of structures and the framework that you've used to make sense out of yourself, and allow you to move into, navigate, run, into this new space.
Yep.
Without having all the apprehension that typically comes from the corrosion and the implosion of the present kind of system.
Right.
And it sounds to me like you've got a mechanism,
By study. There have been studies where they compared two groups of people, chronic cannabis users and non-users, and they expose them to the same stressors, and the chronic cannabis users create less cortisol as a result. So as it turns out, it's going to be the stoners that survive.
Oh. Really? Yeah. Well.
Jump into water, John, it's
but
fine.
I get your point,
Yeah.
of course. I mean, this is really kind of fascinating because what you've got to do in order to fully understand this transition is that you can't try to make sense of it from the previous reality.
Right.
You've got to have this openness, this permeability to be able to say, wait a second, it might work this way, it might this. And some of this is really quite fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, and it makes sense physiologically and anatomically when we look at where the receptors are located in the brain and what areas of the brain are activated
Tell
and
me
inhibited.
about that. What do you mean?
When you use cannabis or apply phytocannabinoids, and to some extent our own, but in general, when we consume cannabis, we're activating receptors that are in key functional areas of our brain. So to what you're speaking
like
to,
what kind of thing?
So the amygdala, that area is kind of our reward center. So that's where we have that euphoria, that, that's where we start to relax and we come out of a stressful state. So we're able to think more clearly and we're able to access more information and solve problems in a better way. The other kind of interesting thing is that we have receptors in our hippocampus, which is a part of the brain that's kind of responsible for our memory. So something that's very therapeutic about cannabis is that it helps you forget. And so when people have been through traumas,
I want to remember.
but certain types
remember
of
the good things.
thinking
Yeah.
that are no longer serving, the direction of the species, it allows those thoughts to kind of be suppressed while new thoughts
Make
can
room
be
for
accessed.
other thoughts.
That's great.
That's why this is so effective for PTSD. Right now, our treatments for PTSD in regular medicine are numbing. This doesn't numb. It actually allows you to turn the page to get past whatever that trauma is that somebody keeps reliving over and over again and can't get out of that
Do
loop.
you have any sense of how that works? I mean, where's the trauma that this engages that
Well,
frees
it
part of the
sets
brain.
up a thought loop. Any thought loop or pattern that's repetitive in the brain creates new neurons. And as those neurons repeat and repeat, that loop gets stronger and stronger. So it becomes harder to
So
break
you
free from.
replay that thing over and over again, and
Whether
then
you
it
want
gets
to or not.
solidified and structured. And
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing I think is kind of interesting that speaks to the bigger picture is that I think one of the mistakes that we get taught, that mother culture is constantly whispering in our ears as humans, is that we are the end point of evolution. Evolution happened for us to get here. Psst. And that's not true. I mean, if you were on the scene when that first jellyfish came out of the ocean and you were a reporter and you said, so what do you think about this whole evolution thing? And the jellyfish said, yeah, this all happened for me. I'm the end point. That's what we do. And that's part of the problem, is that we don't realize that we are still in process and always will be.
There's an amazing amount of hubris that suggests that, we're anything compared to the zillions of planets and entities and species and stuff that have been around for millions, if not billions of years. They're far more advanced than we are.
I want to name a new strain hubris.
Talk to me a little bit more historically, or do you have it about how this has functioned in the past?
You can see throughout time, one of the things that I find interesting is that there was a lot of speculation about who we look back on in time now and think about as great thinkers, whether we're talking about Shakespeare or Einstein or even Jesus. And there is evidence of interaction with cannabis with all of those people. We know musicians have been using, and writers and artists have been using cannabis to sort of get their muse and maybe get the noise out of the way so that they can be more creative. But as it turns out, that the really big thinkers of the world, it appears it's the same thing. There's speculation that the anointing oils that Jesus and his followers used very early on is actually hemp oil. And Shakespeare, they've analyzed his pipes, and they have THC in it. They've found traces of THC in that. It's kind of neat.
You mean Einstein was smoking dope?
It's one way to look at it. One way to look at it. But here's a distinction that I think is important to make, is that I don't think that somebody has to get high or have that euphoric effect from cannabis to get the effect of activating their endocannabinoid receptor. There are.
You're talking about microdosing, right?
Yeah, you talk about microdosing, you talk about using other cannabinoids, and
So Tom, what is that now?
yeah, so CBD is a little bit of the remedy for the head effect that you can get from THC. And so when you use different combinations of CBD and THC, you don't get that euphoric feeling. Also, within the plant, those cannabinoids grow in the plant. They actually grow in a different form. So what you find in the plant is not THC. It's THCA, which is the acidic form. That's non-euphoria. That's what's the word I'm thinking of?
Psychoactive?
Yeah, non-psychoactive or non-impairing. And you have to chemically change it to turn THCA into THC. That's why we smoke pot.
Oh, is that what that does? Yeah.
That's right.
To
And
eat.
so, right, so if you were to find a plant and eat it, you would have an effect without really getting a euphoric effect from it. And so it's not really about getting high or having that euphoric feeling. I don't have any problem with that any different than I have somebody that goes home and drinks a beer or two at the end of the day to relax. But it doesn't have to be that way. And many of the patients that we deal with are older patients that are what we call cannabis naive. They've never used it before.
Right.
They have a problem. They're not looking to get high. They're looking to get out of their pain or sleep or anxiety. And so we use different combinations of the different cannabinoids which affect without making somebody high.
And the medical benefits largely happen outside of the psychoactive effect. So aside from the conditions that really benefit from, an altered perception or a little bit of euphoria or a little bit of amnesia, like chronic pain and things like that, many conditions we're starting to believe are a result of kind of a chronic endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome. So there are a lot of syndromes out there that are kind of mysterious, that like fibromyalgia is one of probably the most common, true afflictions that we just have not identified a cause for, but is becoming more widespread, and reported every year. And that group of patients is responding amazingly to cannabinoid treatment. But what I believe the mechanism is, it's not about activating those brain receptors and creating altered perception. It's about low-dose supplementation to increase the tone of the endocannabinoid system. So it's a support for your own system to kind of reactivate it, wake it up. It's an ancient system. It knows what to do. But we've been removed from access to, all these cannabinoids for so long that we've got several generations now.
So you could
these
literally
syndromes.
take this stuff and not know you're taking it, right?
That's exactly
That's the
right.
goal, yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's, for a lot of my
Maybe you
patients,
should
that's
put
the
it
approach.
In the water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what your goal for your patients?
Well, that's the approach because, again, as we're, as my patients are older, they're often taking a lot of medications, and that's something to definitely be mindful of as we're being responsible using cannabis medically. So lower dosage, lower risk of interactions, and hopefully none of the risk of altered perception and balance impairment and things. We don't want it to be more dangerous for people who are medically vulnerable, but we want to supplement those endocannabinoid systems.
So you would suggest that in appropriate kind of doses or something on a daily basis, it would be broadly advantageous to everything in your kind of life?
Kind of like a tonic.
Yeah, that's what we believe. That's what the theories are. We certainly are ways from proving that out, but that's all in process and very interesting.
One of the common experiences that people have reported from back in the day when they were smoking pot was the first time that they smoked it, they're like, "Hey, what's the big deal? I don't get it." And then the second time they smoked it, it's like, "Oh, that's what everybody's talking about." And the reason is because the first exposure to the endocannabinoids is to the phytocannabinoids is what makes those receptors more active, maybe even bringing them more to the surface of the cell. And then they're ready. And so if you go through an 80 or 90 year period of really prohibition where people weren't allowed to use it, sometimes it takes some shaking to wake up those systems within people. Kind of makes sense.
So what's the name of your dispensary?
So the company I work for is called Curio Wellness, and so we have a wellness center and a dispensary. So we have a holistic pharmacy, we have a spa with acupuncture and massage and estheticians. We do yoga, we do a lot of teaching as well as having the dispensary.
Timonium, right?
In Timonium, yeah.
Timonium, Maryland.
Yep.
North of Baltimore. And
Yep.
Carrie, what's your practice called?
So my practice is called Hempel Integrative Wellness, and I also have kind of a holistic approach. So in addition to doing cannabis medicine, I do some energy work and energy therapies there. I will be having an acupuncturist, and really I'm hoping to just expand that to, having as many holistic modalities accessible as we can.
When she talks about her energy work, because one of the things that we're going to do at the workshop later today is actually have Carrie energetically activate people's endocannabinoid receptors that are in the audience. What they may feel is energy. They may feel, just a sense of wellness as we start to activate those receptors.
Thanks for being with us today.
It's our pleasure.
And thank you. Thank you for being with us. It's been a fascinating conversation with Dr. Carrie Hempel and Dr. Brian Sanderoff, who are in the leading edge of the medical cannabis kind of movement down the street from where we live here in Berkeley Springs, West Virginia. They're from the Baltimore area, and we very much enjoyed the conversation. Appreciate them being here with us. We hope that you'll come and learn more about some of what we're doing here in Berkeley Springs. TransitionTalks.org is the place where you can learn about our series of speakers that we bring in, like Carrie and Brian, every month, to talk about the big changes that are going on in the world. We've got a marvelous kind of lineup going all the way into next year, into July, and we'd love to have you come out and visit our town. So thanks, and come back again. I'm John Peterson. This is Postscript, and thanks for being with us.